So let's talk through every single Space Marine armed with a basic bolter in Warhammer 40K, and rate each rank and file of the astartes for in-game power. Jumping straight into it, let's start with the obvious with the Primaris Intercessors. Games Workshop's Primaris upgrade on the Tactical Squad for 8th edition, having a fairly iconic silhouette, and being ready to intercede on the behalf of all the other Space Marines no doubt. Intercessors are 80 points per 5, and you get your standard Space Marine stat line, 2 wounds at toughness 4, with objective control 2 as a more battle line troop sort of unit, and their armament is the standard bolt rifle, quite improved on certain basic bolters out there, 2 shots to 24 inches, but also getting AP-1, the assault keyword and the heavy keyword, basically meaning that they can move a little bit faster and still put out firepower, or get more accurate if they're sat still. They also get 1 free grenade launcher between 5, which can help them threaten heavies a little bit, plus the sergeant can take fancy melee weapons such as a power fist or thunder hammer, which means they're really not hopeless in melee either. A whole bunch of strength 4 AP 0, damage 1 volume attacks, plus the sergeant's weapon. At the moment, intercessors aren't awful for Space Marine armies, but are a little overshadowed maybe. The main reason to take them tends to be their objective secured rule. It's one of those sticky objectives type rules where if you take an objective in your command phase, then that will remain yours even if the intercessors move on to do other things or skirmish with the enemy. Sometimes it just makes sense to sit around and defend, but it means that you could maybe spread out and deep strike screen, and it means if they get shot to death on say a midfield point, then the point will still be yours if your opponent can't get there. As a result, often in more optimised lists, if you are using intercessors, it generally tends to be just one small unit of 5 of them. They just don't really have the raw damage and defensive stats to justify themselves beyond that, unless you just want to field them because you have the models, or like the theme of Bolter Marines on the table. Anvil Siege Force can make them a little bit shootier, I suppose, if you really want to. In any case though, I'd say they're usable enough in game right now. I've chosen to rank them a 7 out of 10 per power. Before we get into the bulk of the video, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, a mobile game that you might have seen advertised around the internet before. It's basically a hex-based game where you have a team of 5 characters, level them up, and then fight through a whole bunch of set enemy levels over a hex grid. If you're looking for a little bit of entertainment for downtime with a mobile game, it could be of interest to some of you. You have very straightforward and punchy short runs of battles that don't take too long, and then you basically level up characters a bit, so in theory they're a bit better for next time, and there's a bunch of different variant game modes. Here's an example of one of their heroes in Commissar Yarrick. They have active abilities and passive abilities, which do have quite big in-game effects for how you use them against enemies, and you can level up their base stats and equip them with items and things. In a battle you basically have a collection of up to 5 heroes. There's a bit of basic strategy with how you command them in game, and also a bit more campaign strategy with how best to acquire them and spend your resources, and then it's a bit of an I go you system with the teams moving and acting with all their units, usually you versus an AI. I quite enjoyed playing the first few levels of it at least, though I've not got very far in yet. You basically take command of some Ultramarines and blast away at some Necrons. I'll talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of it at the end of the video for those interested, but otherwise there'll be links down in the video description. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Getting back to the many bolters of the Warhammer 40k tabletop though, next up we have the Sternguard veterans, 90 points per 5 of them, and the Space Marine elites largely have a fairly similar stat line to the intercessors, but OC1 rather than OC2. They can either take the bolt rifles versus the combi weapons, though the bolt rifles tend to wind up more effective against the vast majority of targets besides just a few choice things like Terminators. They've got really quite brutal damage output, with 3 shots at 12 inches and 2 shots to 24. Basically the same stat line and keywords as a bolt rifle, but also adding devastating wounds in as well. And that does make them really quite general purpose, and while they're still better against lighter infantry, it means that they will at least be able to stack a bunch of damage on tough stuff if you roll a few 6s. Beyond that, they also get a Sternguard heavy bolter that can have some nice devastating wounds as well, and even more so than the intercessors, the squad's no slouch in close combat really. The regular guys get a big 4 attacks, and so can the sergeant armed with a power fist, so fairly savage against their peer light to medium infantry. Their special rule is a bit weaker than it used to be though, re-rolling wound rolls of 1 when targeting the Oath of Moment targets. It's not nothing, but it's also not huge. Since the Space Marine Codex, they've tended to be a unit that's just sort of struggled for a place in more optimised Space Marine lists. Their issue is that while the devastating wounds keeps them relevant against tough stuff, they're still not quite as scary as the actual big damage dealers that you might be able to choose from, and for a cheaper bolter sort of unit kind of role, they've just got really quite a lot of competitors that might have a bit less damage than them, but have all sorts of other interesting things, fun special rules that can buff the rest of your army or deny enemy deep strike or something, which in general people tend to value a bit more than the punchy devastating wounds. As a result, they tend to be kind of niche to basically unplayed in competitive lists, but they're a unit that can be kind of fine to even strong in casual play, just fairly easy to use with scary bolters that can threaten most things, and only a small amount more than intercessors, even if they do lose the special rule. In terms of optimizing a list though, I would say they're maybe a little bit on the costly side. Perhaps something like 85 points per 5 might be a bit better for them. I've chosen to give them a 6.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the heavy intercessors. These guys are equipped in chunky Gravis armor and have the heavy bolt rifle. Really quite a big chunky one there, and really stretches the definition of what counts as small arms in 40k. After the points update, there are mere 95 points per 5 of them, and get kind of ridiculous defensive stats for that kind of cost. Toughness 6 at 3 wounds and a 3+ save, and as their troops intercessors, they're OC2 as well. That's enough of a defensive profile to give quite a lot of squads a pause, and they get even better against damage 1 attacks where they get to improve their saving throw. For their actual bolt rifles, compared with the regular intercessor ones, they're 30-inch range rather than 24, and strength 5 rather than strength 4. I feel like the profile is kind of deceptive though. The pip of strength is nice, but in 10th edition it doesn't necessarily add quite as much as it might have done in previous times, though 1 per 5 of them can back that up with a heavy bolter which has a bit more punch. I feel like after the points cut they've got a bit more interesting. The main issue with them is exactly what battlefield role they're going to fill, as they have strong competition for basically anything they try and do. You could just hit them on a home field objective, but if you do that they're probably going to be ignored and they don't really have the greatest damage output per point. Or if you push them up to the midfield to make the opponent actually have to deal with their defensive profiles, they don't really exactly excel in close range given that they don't get any fancy melee gear. Still though, even with their downsides, I feel like they're usable enough, particularly at the 95 point cost. I've chosen to rank them at a 7.5 out of 10. Again, they're a unit that could get on really well with the Anvil Siege Force with the +1 to hit and wound that they can get, as they are a unit that can credibly sit in the open and survive firepower. Or could be nice with Iron Father Phyros of the Iron Hands, giving them a 5+ feel no pain and adding them some much needed melee threat, and being a bodyguard for him as he stomps around putting vehicles back together. Next up, we've got the classic Space Marine Tactical Squad. 140 points per 10 of them now, so the cheapest Marines in power armor that you can field in the Codex currently. You have to buy them in squads of 10, but they can split in half into 2 different combat squads, though it does kind of feel like that's a special rule that doesn't really give them a special rule, given that you can choose to field most squads that way anyway. They have the same sort of profile as intercessors, with OC2, so a little bit better for objectives, though they only have 2 attacks rather than 3 sadly. I feel like the standard bolters that they get are actually kind of disappointing. I feel like they probably should have been at least a little bit closer to the intercessor bolt rifles. They're only 2 shots at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1, so not really good for too much besides clearing out the lightest of enemy infantry. I feel like perhaps they should have just had AP 1 at base, perhaps to differentiate from the other Imperials that can use bolters, and then maybe make the bolt rifle special thing the fact that it gets the assault and the heavy keywords perhaps. In any case, sadly the bolters aren't really the main reason that you take the tactical squad, it's more that you get a multi-melter in the unit plus a special weapon and some sort of fancy power weapon like a power fist on the sergeant. At the cheap points cost, it does mean that you can put 2 very cheap units of Astartes on the table, maybe have the cheap bolter squad sat to babysit a home field objective or something, or act as an expendable midfield screen, and then load all the dangerous stuff into 1 combat squad and play a little bit more carefully with it, hopefully getting multi-melter fire and special weapons to work on the enemy on the midfield, and maybe follow it up with a charge if it makes sense. Unfortunately, even at the low points cost, I really wouldn't rate tactical squads as that great. They feel like a unit that you can make work if you set out to do so, and having a punchy heavy weapon on a grunt squad definitely isn't the worst thing in the world. But again, they're competing with a lot of rival Space Marines that either have better damage, faster movement, deep strike or a bunch of special rules. It just seems that being kind of cheap plus having 1 big gun isn't usually enough to justify them versus their competitors. They're definitely way more usable than they were when they were more like 160 points though. Realistically not crazily behind the pack. I've chosen to rate them a 6 out of 10 here. Next up we have the Infiltrators, 100 points per 5 of them. These guys are sneaky Phobos Marines and armed with the Marksman Bolt Carbine. Again, for these guys not really being the showcase piece of the actual unit, it's basically the stat line of a standard bolter, but you get the heavy keyword, so a little bit more accurate if standing still, though I feel like it's basically never a reason to choose to, unless you gain literally nothing by moving. Infiltrators are pretty common to borderline auto-include status for Space Marine lists. They can infiltrate, and that's a nice option, but they more commonly tend to be tasked with guarding a home field objective, using their Omni Scramblers to deny deep strikeouts to 12 inches. They're a little bit tankier than usual, with the Helix Gauntlet defending them against damage to attacks quite well, and also get the Smoke keyword as well if that should make more sense than Armour of Contempt. They're just seen as a very good utility unit, as they can either do that, or actually deploy and use their Infiltrate keyword in the midfield, if you're not too worried about the opponent deep striking or coming in from reserves. Overall, they're just an all-round strong unit, usually one copy of them featuring in the vast majority of strong Space Marine lists. I've chosen to give them a 9.5 out of 10 for this one. Sticking with the Phobos though, and next up we have the Incursors, 80 points per 5 of these guys, the same sort of basic Space Marine stat line with OC1, and their weapon of choice is the Oculus Bolt Carbine. Again, a fairly basic bolter profile, but this one has more useful keywords in my opinion. You get to advance and shoot it with the assault keyword, so you don't have to choose between making fast progress towards midfield objectives or shooting, and you also get to ignore cover as well. I think both of those are likely to be far more useful for their kind of role versus the heavy keyword. They also have a little bit more threat up close than standard bolter guys would usually have. Their paired combat blades give them sustained hits in melee, and they also have a haywire mine to throw at the enemy the first time that they make combat. D3 mortal wounds on a 2+ or more if it's vehicles. Otherwise they have the scout keywords to allow them to move up into the midfield, though really again the main reason to take these guys above everything else is their special rule. Their nice scanner packs with their multi-spectrum array are great for marking targets for other astartes shooting. One thing that they've shot basically gets a +1 to hit from it for the entire rest of your Space Marine army if they're firing at it, and that's really quite powerful when it's a buff that could apply to a lot of things. Again, they tend to be a unit that you might just have one of for that special rule, as there's big diminishing returns on that, particularly when you can put Oath of Moment on one target to guarantee most of the hits anyway. But if you've got a fairly shooting heavy Space Marine army, they can be usable enough between just being some scouting bodies with a few small arms and adding some extra damage via their buffing rule. I've chosen to give them a 7.5 out of 10. Next up we have the Skullmasked Reavers. These guys are the spooky scary Space Marine terror troops, their main things being some mobility rules, battle shock shenanigans and precision. They can deep strike with grav shoots, which I feel like is probably the better option versus the grapnel launcher for ignoring the vertical distance, though it definitely is quite a cool rule for big built up maps, and they also have the scout move as well, so you'd have a fair few options for how you use them each game. Then for their weapon loadout, they've either got the option of their version of the bolter, which is the bolt carbine, essentially just a very standard bolter but gaining the precision keyword, or going for the special issue bolt pistol and combat knife. I feel like the armament isn't so important that one of them is just enormously better than the other. I guess if you're using them for small deep striking action and objective type units, at least you could guarantee a flurry of 10 shots once they drop in and get into the right place for say behind enemy lines or something. Though my instinct is probably that the combat knife and the special issue bolt pistol is the best overall deal. Otherwise they also do some battle shock things, one test at the start of the fight phase and an aura of debuffing leadership. Sometimes it can matter, sometimes not, and their precision keyword is maybe a little bit on the light side for threatening more armoured characters with only strength 4 AP0 weapons for the most part. Overall I still feel like Reavers are kind of overshadowed, even with their points cost dropping down to 75. Definitely far less of a clearly outclassed unit though, now that they're cheaper than the jump intercessors rather than the other way round. I've chosen to give them a 6 out of 10 for power. I still can't really see too many competitive Space Marine lists choosing to take them. You could get suppressors for small objective dropping units with a little bit more heavy firepower, and jump intercessors are still very efficient with their speed and damage. Finally for the core Space Marine Codex, where the primary armament of the squad is the bolter, I thought I'd throw in the Space Marine Scouts. You can equip the entire squad with bolt guns if you want to, though they do have a few other options including the combat blades and the shotguns too. The Scouts are 65 points per 5 of them, only get the 4+ save, not the 3+, due to being in carapace armour, and have both the infiltrate and scout keyword, so really good for midfield ball control, and just being 65 points means they're nicely expendable as well, which is pretty good for the Space Marine army wanting to sacrifice the least amount of points possible when trading things on objectives. On top of that, they've got a rather nice return to reserve special rule called Guerrilla Tactics, basically being able to fade away and come back on via strategic reserve, which could be quite nice late game to score some extra points. And to be honest, beyond all that, what they're actually armoured with isn't the biggest deal in the world. If they can chip in with a little bit of extra damage as they go, it's helpful. For their weapons, I feel like all of them are fine enough. Bolt guns, shotguns, and the combat knives are alright. I'd probably be most tempted by the shotguns out of the 3 though, just for the assault keyword, meaning that they get a little bit of damage when they advance, which sometimes might be the most important thing. Otherwise, the sergeant can take a chainsword for a little bit of AP on his melee. You can get a missile launcher or a heavy bolter, which are both fine, and also a sniper rifle that some choose to take and some don't. Overall, those scouts are just an incredibly efficient unit for the Space Marines, very cheap midfield board control, and can block out enemy scouts or other infiltrators. Just putting them down out of line of sight on a midfield objective can be a good start to the game for scoring points, and it's pretty common to see 1 or 2 units in the majority of strong Space Marine armies. Overall, between all that, I've given them a 9.5 out of 10 for power. Moving into the more divergent chapters now, and next up we have the Space Wolf Grey Hunters. They're sort of the tactical squad equivalent of the Space Wolves, given that they have their training with true grit and being able to hold their bolters in the pistol grip when in melee. Each of them can also take an Astartes chainsword as well, so potentially you can have a squad that's got a little bit more range damage than a pistol and still be hitting at 3 attacks at strength 4 AP 1 in melee. Their bolters will also be able to advance and shoot as well, which doesn't hurt if they are wandering around between objectives. Besides that, a pair of them can take some special weapons. Plasma and melter gun can be quite nice, and the sergeant can take a power fist. Overall, between all that, stats-wise, they compare pretty well for damage versus a lot of the more standard Space Marines that maybe fall into the same sort of category as Stern Guard. Interesting enough, having a Space Marine squad that's just got a little bit more damage versus its competitors, but not really adding quite as much different or unique, versus a bunch of things that have the special rules. I guess maybe you could use them with Ulrich the Slayer to make their chainswords a bit more nasty. I feel like he might be kind of tempted to help out the Blood Claws though. In any case, I'd say they're not unusable, but not really standout. I've not really seen many people using them in tournament Space Wolf lists. I've chosen to give them a 7 out of 10 here. I guess technically we could talk about Wolf Guard and Wolf Scouts for the Space Wolves, though I feel like in reality Wolf Guard are going to be more tempted by their melee weapons, and Wolf Scouts maybe aren't so enormously different to regular Scouts, but just throw in a couple of scary damage dealing weapons. As it stands with their datasheets, I rate them both as usable but not really stand out. I'd probably still go for the regular Scout version over the Wolf one. Moving on to the Blood Angels though, next up we have the Death Company with bolt rifles. These guys had their datasheet separated out from the melee Primaris Death Company now. You get 90 points per unit of 5 of them, and they have an interesting sort of slightly side-graded stat line on intercessors, with some big positives but also some big downsides. For their weapons, they get the standard bolt rifles that both get the assault and heavy keyword now, where previously they didn't. One can take a grenade launcher, and then you get a couple of scary melee weapons per unit. The sergeant can take a thunder hammer or power fist, and then you also get an eviscerator per 5 as well. And given that Death Company always reroll to hit in close combat, you actually still have a squad that's really quite genuinely threatening in melee. Even if the regular guys with the bolters aren't doing as much work hitting with volume attacks at AP 0, they're a little bit tougher than regular Space Marines as well, having a baked in 6+ feel no pain, so again that's kind of nice versus things that are damaged too. And then they have a fun special rule called Visions of Heresy. Once per turn you get to fire Overwatch or Heroic Intervene with a unit for free, and then you either get to reroll hits during Overwatch or reroll charges if you're heroically intervening. This all does come with the big downside of the Black Rage though, which means that if you're not near a Chaplain model, the objective control falls to 0, which is kind of a big deal. Going from being quite a good unit for skirmishing over objectives to one that literally can't do things, and you're also not able to fall back as well, which sometimes might not be the biggest deal in the world when you've got a few scary melee weapons in the unit, but sometimes it could be really annoying. Overall, between the offering and versus the competitors, I feel like these guys aren't going to be run quite so much, again perhaps falling into the same sort of bracket as Stern Guard and Grey Hunters, in a bit of an awkward mid-tier squad that's a fair bit scarier than the standard intercessors, but still maybe not quite getting to the point where their damage and defense is just outright great in itself. These guys really aren't too far away and do have interesting things with their Overwatch, but I feel like the downside of having chaplains being necessary to take objectives and things is quite a big one. They're not really the sort of unit that you'd really want to pay the points for a chaplain on top of what they already do, otherwise you're making a fairly inefficient unit there. So you need to play quite carefully with them and not have them stray too far away from the chaplain's influence, which could be a bit irritating to try and do if you've got a smaller squad of them that you might ideally want scrapping over objectives. Overall, maybe a little bit conflicted about them. I really don't think that they're that bad for their damage and defense, but it can also seem people wanting to load up on the actual melee Death Company Marines, where you get their better chainswords in melee and things. Overall, I've chosen to give them a 6 out of 10. Definitely not awful, and the Overwatch is fun, but also probably likely to be overshadowed for most battlefield roles. Next up, we've got the Black Templars, and your Primaris Crusader squad can also be equipped with bolters. The big Primaris Initiates getting the bolt rifles, and the Neophytes sort of get one consolidated profile in Neophyte firearms, which basically uses the shotgun profile even if a few of them are modelled with bolters. The Crusaders are 150 points per 10 of them, or 320 for 20. They did suffer quite a big nerf to the big size squad recently. And for this video, their bolter loadout maybe isn't quite as relevant, given that they get some seriously nasty chainswords. It means that the Initiates basically always want to take those. For some reason you get 5 attacks per guy with those, so a massive volume of strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1 attacks, and in reality that does tend to outweigh the couple of shots that the bolt rifle can get. Overall though, they're definitely an interesting unit. They can scout, reroll advances and charges, and be a big unit for synergy like 5+ Feel No Pains from Tannhauser's Bones or Grimaldus. I feel like Games Workshop really was a bit brutal to them with the nerf of their bigger sized squads though. I thought they were at least fairly well balanced before, even if a couple of people were managing to have tournament success with them. 320 just really feels like quite a lot for what they do. Maybe could just about creep into being worth it if you build around them with the Feel No Pains and attached characters, but I feel like a lot of players are going to look elsewhere these days. They're definitely not unplayable though. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 here. Their 40-point nerf did feel a bit unnecessary though. Sticking with the Templars, and their regular Crusader squad can also take bolters. I feel like for them it's maybe a little bit more tempting. Though even here, and even if they're equipped with broadly ranged things, the melee chainswords might still have the better value. They can be fairly interesting cheap little units though, 85 points per 5 marines that get a heavy weapon, special weapon and a bit of sergeant gear is at least fairly efficient, not too bad for a small skirmish unit, and I did see them getting used in Ironstorm Spearhead where you might have a single reroll. Could be nice for a las cannon or something. I feel like they're going to be unlikely to be the sort of units that you build up into a big squad and build around though, particularly after Games Workshop increased the price for them a bit arbitrarily again. Maybe the sort of mid-sized squad could have some interest as well. It's 135 points for 5 initiates and 5 scouts. I believe that's one of the single cheapest ways to get Space Marines on the board right now. I guess besides the base scout squad, but then you don't get any Empower armor. Overall, again I'd say probably not awful, but not really standout. I've also given them a 6.5 out of 10. Far less of a big centerpiece, but okay for some bodies on the line that have some surprising damage with a heavy and special weapon. Lastly, for the Loyalists, we've got the Deathwatch Kill Team, 100 points per 5 of them, and fighting out of the Imperial Agents Codex. When they're equipped with bolters, it'll be the Long Vigil ranged weapon, and that one essentially gets the combi weapon style profile. They can also take the Stalker pattern bolt gun, which is a heavy gun with precision, and mix in some combat shotguns if you want to. Again though, I feel like they're a bit of an example of 40k's free war gear cost not working out great for these small arms. It's usually just going to make sense to load up on the heavy thunder hammers, Infernus heavy bolters and frag cannons, and leave the little guns at home. Overall for raw power I don't think they're terrible at 100 points, but just not really to the point where they can carry the struggling Imperial Agents Codex all on their own, even if they can do a few interesting things like infiltrate in the fleet detachment and have access to the Watchmaster as a good buffing character. Overall, I've rated them a 7.5 out of 10 here. Scary enough damage output between their shooting and then some heavy thunder hammer melee, but that's not exactly for their combi weapons. Next up, we've got the Chaos Legionaries, the Dark Mirror of the Tactical Squad, and the rank and file of the Legions of the Dark Gods, a somewhat similar thing but with a fair few more spikes. They're 90 points per 5 of them, or 170 per 10, having one of Games Workshop's new things where the bigger squad is a bit cheaper, and otherwise for their standard bolter guys it's fairly similar to the Tactical Squad, OC2, and then a regular bolt gun that gets no extra AP. Again, they're a unit that can load up on a fair bit of special kit, likely having a heavy weapon and a couple of heavy melee weapons per the small unit of 5 of them. And again, seeing as they have the option that they are generally likely to be swapping out those bolt guns for chainswords, the potential for 4 attacks in melee at strength 4, AP 1, damage 1 is just seen a fair bit better than 2 attacks at range and then 3 in melee all at AP 0. And they can kind of add to the critical mass of close combat threat along with the heavy melee weapons, particularly as they get some inbuilt wound rerolls against things on objectives, and dark packs with a chaos icon to buff them further. I guess if you really did want to spec them for range, they might not be awful though. You could take the Mark of Nurgle or Mark of Tzeentch and Pact Bound maybe, back them up with a heavy weapon and deal some damage. In any case, overall Legionaries are very strong for the Chaos Space Marines, commonly seen jumping out of Rhinos alongside Chaos Lords. I've given them a 9 out of 10 here, though very much not for the bolters. Next up, we've got the Rubik Marines of the Thousand Suns, clanking Egyptian-styled automata, all filled with sorcerous dust that used to be Space Marines once upon a time. Their bolters are a little bit more dangerous than the average, getting the Inferno bolt gun, represented here by strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1. As all too regularly seems to be the case, they're just not particularly well balanced versus the other whole squad option, which is the Warp Flamer. That gets you D6 auto hits at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, all with ignores cover and torrent. And despite the range being limited to 12 inches between the Overwatch, the ignores cover and the greater volume fire, they're pretty much universally taken as the main option. I've only seen people very occasionally using the bolt guns of these in a squad that they're sure they're going to be keeping a bit further back. Most folks tend to just run full warp flamers though, with the thinking that it's just best to deal absolutely massive damage if you get close and not worry about a few stray shots otherwise. Beyond that though, they've got quite a lot going on. They can take a Soul Reaper cannon, a Warp Flame pistol on the Aspiring Sorcerer, they generate a Cabal point, and they get to reroll wound rolls against things on objectives, which is kind of massive. It does mean those Warp Flamers can seriously burn things down, particularly with certain attached characters with psychic shooting. Their Icon of Flame can also add to that, improving AP by 1 on critical wounds. Their small squads did go up very slightly in the last Thousand Suns points update, though the big squads went down a bit. I wonder if we'll see a few more people using the big 10-man squads alongside Araman as a damage dealer maybe. But either way, they're still looking like they're going to be pretty integral to the Thousand Suns with their cast of sorcerers. I've chosen to give them a 9 out of 10 for strength rating, though it probably would have been higher than that prior to the last update. The Death Guard Plague Marines are very hard to kill as they rot away within their armour. The rank and file Space Marine kit of the Death Guard, with 2 wounds each at Toughness 5 and OC 2 for objectives. And that seems to be the case with quite a lot of Space Marines that have options. 10th edition free war gear just isn't kind to the basic bolters, even if they might get plague bolt guns that get lethal hits against their foes. Given just the fairly vast amount of free war gear that you can get, it makes sense to take some heavy plague weapons, any special weapons, and then maybe load up with bubotic weapons for the remainder, which when you put them all together can be really quite savage in close combat, and are often juiced up with the critical hits of the Biologist Putrefier, or the fights first of a Foul Blight spawn, and all piling out of a Rhino to get them there. Really quite a strong unit in game for the Death Guard at the moment. I'll give them a 9 out of 10 there, but again very much not for the bolters. I kind of wonder if they might be a good unit to have a split datasheet at some point when they do get their codex. At least that could be one way of having the bolt guns actually kind of viable, as opposed to the strictly worse option. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, and hoping for an update in the not too distant future now, are the Noise Marines, and these really do complete the Chaos Pantheon of Marines that can take bolters but don't really want to because they've got better things. Instead of the humble bolt gun, they'll be taking the souped up Sonic Blaster, that one gaining the assault keyword, and with the excruciating frequencies of Slanesh, that'll be 3 attacks at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. Plus throwing in the Mighty Blastmaster with its big damage 3 attacks and a Doom Siren for good measure. All that amounts to genuinely quite good damage output for a unit of skirmishing troops, and the leader can take a Power Fist as well. It seems like they're one of the few smaller squads that actually seems to break the difference, where small squads of Marines can be considered some of the primary damage dealers. I guess the Dark Pacts and the Chaos Icon certainly helping with that. There have certainly been a few of them used in strong Chaos lists recently, including the Emperor's Children that won the London Grand Tournament, and they do seem very solid overall. I'd give them an 8.5 out of 10 for power. Overall, I must admit that for a few of these, it has just underlined the impression that certain squads work a lot better with Games Workshop's free war gear than otherwise. It does maybe feel a bit weird when we've got things like Plague Marines and Rubent Marines that can take bolters, but basically it never makes sense to, just because they have another war gear option and the datasheets aren't separated out like certain things out there. For the Space Marines that do take bolt guns, I guess the ones that I'd rate as the strongest out of the video would probably be the Infiltrators and maybe the Scouts. I guess they're just getting there more for their utility than anything they do with their bolters though. Otherwise, I suppose for damage and defense style units, I'd probably give it to the Stern Guard Veterans, Grey Hunters, or Heavy Intercessors perhaps. I feel like they do all have their interest in their own ways, even if they're not super commonly seen in competitive Space Marine lists. Let me know your thoughts on the standard Space Marines with the Holy Bolter though. Look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments below. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the sponsor of today's video, which was Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, as mentioned earlier, a 40k themed mobile game where you have a bunch of heroes and characters battling it out over a hex grid. You're fine with me talking about a few of the positives and negatives that I found with the game. In general, some of my favourite things are that you have a fairly constant sense of progression, never really losing anything too punishing if you don't succeed in any one battle. The games are fairly short and punchy, so quite nice for a short distraction, and there's certainly some genuine strategy to it as well. You can try out various different builds themed around the different 40k races, potentially command them better against the maps and challenges that you set against, and also have a bit of an overarching strategy to unlock things efficiently. Broadly speaking, it's fairly ad-free as well. You can occasionally choose to watch one or two if it makes sense for the reward if you really want it, but it feels far less pushed than some mobile games out there. For a few potential criticisms, it is a mobile free-to-play game with all that entails. The main thing I'd go to them for is for a bit of fun entertainment, more so than anything else. As with a few of them, it can be a little bit grindy, though I'm not hugely against that in a mobile game where you don't necessarily have to think too hard about things. As ever, there's an upgrade microtransaction shop that I've personally not used on principle, unless you've played enough that you want to support the developers. Mobile games do generally have a bit of an element of pay to succeed easier, even if it's not directly pay to win, and a few reports that I've seen say that it can start out very smoothly, but then eventually the difficulty curve can cause progress to slow down a bit, so bear that in mind when starting out. Beyond that though, I found it entertaining enough. The battles do have a nice feel to them, they've got a fair amount of updates and content, with a fairly steady stream of new campaigns, heroes and events, various seasons of play and balance patches, and quite a lot to explore in game. Currently there's over 70 heroes and 8 campaigns to unlock and play. In any case, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check it out either via the QR code or the link in the video description if you want to try a 40k mobile game. In any case though, I'll leave that here for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to the Bolter Marines in Warhammer 40k, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll hopefully be back in the not too distant future. Feel free to check out the links in the video description if you want to support the channel in any way. There's the Patreon page and the discount links for the various 40k retailers around the world. Anything bought through them does go to help support the channel. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.